Hi class. Today, since I posted the test ahead of time, it's kind of a lull. Today I decided to go over my research for extra credit opportunities. So I will be posting an extra credit assignment. It consists of 4 questions and it's worth 10 points. So this is in addition to, this is what's supposed to be added on to your exam, but because of the way the exam works through Canvas, I can't put extra credit on it. So this will help with that and give you 5 extra points because of situation of transitioning online. I figured I would give everyone a little bit extra. And then also you do have that extra credit assignment that I posted also, which is worth 30 points. So you can have a total of 40 points extra credit, which is a short assignment. And then 30 points, which will make up a lab. So hopefully that will help you out. So today I'm going to be going over my research. So this is my title that I'm using. Resistance is not futile. So this is what I did for a presentation that's now canceled, postponed. So what I am essentially looking at is patterns of warfare among the Colorado River peoples, specifically the human-speaking peoples. So these are, if you've ever been gone down to the river to enjoy the summer and gone down to Parker, this is the Colorado River Indian tribes, which are down there. That's the Mojave. And if you go down even further to Yuma, Arizona, that's named after the human people who are also known as the Kachan. So these are the people that I will be talking about. Oh, and if you go down to Tucson. No, Tucson? Is that right? Tempe. If you go down to Tempe, the Salt River Gila tribes are also part of this discussion too. So think of it as everything that's along the Colorado and Gila rivers that includes both the California and Arizona sides. So, like I said, this is the area to contextualize it for you. So, as you can see here, we have the Mojave, Halkidoma, who were expelled from this region in the historic period, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The Kachan, and then it extends this way along the Gila River to what's now Tempe, okay, where Arizona State is. So what I am essentially doing is countering a narrative. So what a lot of, in the past, anthropologists have been colonizers themselves, and they have put on these narratives upon indigenous people of, especially that they immediately adopted European technology as soon as Europeans came to the New World. And this is because their technology, the indigenous technology, was inferior, and the colonial technology was superior. So it was automatically saying that indigenous people were inferior to white people. Okay, so this discussion, what I'm going to be talking about is countering narratives that indigenous people automatically adopted weapons, okay, firearms and steel, because I have this, there's this case that I will be going into where they did not do that. They still maintain traditional ways of warfare and also using traditional methods. Okay, so my goals of this study are, and this is my dissertation, right? So this is going to be kind of theoretical, but I'll try and break it down. My goals are complexifying indigenous colonial history of North America. I am also exploring the efficacy of experimental archaeological methods, which I'll get into in a second, because what I'm doing is not typical archaeology here. It combines biomechanical engineering, forensics will be talked about in class, remember bioarchaeology too, and also ethnohistory. So ethnohistory is a way that we can use indigenous perspectives, use oral histories to reconstruct the past. So it relies more heavily on an indigenous perspective than it does a colonial perspective. Okay, so by indigenous I mean Native Americans in this context, just to clarify. So we are also, through this study, I'm also understanding how indigenous peoples negotiated a changing world. So this is important because a lot of societies were in transition during this period. Okay, so what we're looking at is transitions. And now we're undergoing another one, right? Coronavirus is a huge transition. So it's important to understand how people adapt to a changing world. Who wins, who loses, what changes, and how do people maintain their society in the face of this change, okay? We'll be getting into that a little bit. So the main question I'm asking is, why did the human peoples continue to use the war club when other groups, I'm sure everyone knows the Comanche are Utes, maybe not Utes, but Comanche had a horse empire where they were adapted to the horse, and they were riding on horseback using steel weapons, firearms, like the Sioux, right? The Sioux in Custer's Last Stand is the infamous case of this, right? They used firearms, they used repeating firearms. So why were the human groups using these war clubs well into the historic? The last account we have of them using these war clubs was 1857. Very late in terms of historical contact, right? So this was right before the Civil War. This was after the Gold Rush. And so people were still using these clubs. So what I do is, like I said, ethnohistory. So looking at indigenous perspectives on history. Okay, trying to go past the colonial lens. And so this is by colonial lens, I mean accounts by Spanish explorers and Anglo-Americans, soldiers, U.S. soldiers who came into the area, and settlers and what I call squatters, right? People who took the land. And I'm also using experimental archaeology. So what's different about experimental archaeology is that we use replicative experiments to try and recreate tools and see how they were used and try to connect that back to the artifacts themselves, okay, and the actual archaeological record. So this is what we dig up, okay, so we try to connect it back to that. And part of this, what I'm doing is a biomechanical engineering experiment that combines a bit of, through this experiment we can get forensic data that we can compare to bioarchaeological remains and also forensic cases. So how lethal are these clubs? What kind of trauma do they cause? Okay. So Colorado River was first explored by the Spanish in the 1500s. Okay. But the most important expedition is the De Anza expedition, and De Anza tried to connect Sonora to California because they had just established missions in California. So this was supposed to be an overland route that would connect the two. Okay, there was already routes connecting New Mexico to Sonora, and this one was supposed to connect, go through the Colorado River and connect California to Sonora. Okay, so you see, this is where we are. This is Las Vegas is up here. So we see this is a little bit further down. So Lake Mead dammed the Colorado River, right? The Hoover Dam. So this is kind of where we are. So what we see during the historic period when colonials come in is the previous exchange networks were completely changed. So what we have here is a map of indigenous exchange networks. As you can see, they're all throughout North America. They're all connected. So this kind of goes against what you've been taught in school, right? That, oh, nobody communicated. There was no contact. You can even see that there were trade centers in northern Mexico that were also connected to, like, the Aztecs. So everything was more fluid. Everything was dynamic, right? It's a dynamic past. It's not static. People didn't just stay in one place. They moved constantly. Goods moved constantly. Information moved constantly. There's accounts that the Mojave knew what was going on in Zuni Pueblo. That the Mojave here knew what was going on, that the Spanish were here, even before they had actual contact with them. They knew because of contact with groups from the coast here and groups in the Hopi and Zuni Pueblos, okay, where they were already being colonized. So what we had is a previous exchange network where there was pots, beads, mostly beads, leather, and cotton goods being traded back and forth between the Southwest and California. And you see how the Colorado River tribes were right in the middle of it, right? and they had two existing exchange networks that we'll talk about later. But what happened when the colonial Spain came in is that it disrupted the trade network. So instead of traditional beads, cotton, it now switched to cattle, trade goods, so glass beads, and also steel goods to some extent, knives and such. But most importantly, captives. So there was an extensive indigenous trade, slave trade, right? So the Spanish needed labor for their mines in Sonora, or silver mines. So they were getting it from indigenous groups, and what happened is that some indigenous groups were trading with the Spanish, and some were extremely hostile. So the hostile tribes were getting raided for slaves that were then traded to Sonora, and also tribes were raiding, or groups were raiding the coast, the missions for cattle. And what changed at first, when the De Anza expedition, what I mentioned earlier, they came in, the human peoples were very receptive to the trade. They were bringing in stuff they wanted. But they overstayed their welcome. They brought in disease. They trampled their crops because they had a horticulture, okay? So they had a lot of melons, mesquite, and even corn there, maize. And they were trampling their crops. So what they did is they actually expelled the Yuman, the Quechan, and the Mojave expelled the Spanish from the Colorado River. And the Spanish tried to come back. They did punitive expeditions, but they never came back because of the at the same time the Mexican Revolution happened, the first one, okay, the liberation of Mexico. And so the Mojave were able to keep the Spanish from being there. But what happened is the Helcadoma, that tribe I previously mentioned, and the Maricopa allied themselves with the Spanish in these punitive expeditions, and so it created a lot of bad blood between them, it appears. Okay, these are from ethnohistoric accounts. And so what happened is that here they're Papago and Upper Pima, but we know them as the Tohono O'odham and O'odham. Okay, it's the correct terminology for them. Papago and Pima are archaic terms. They had a lot of connections, trade connections with the Spanish. Okay, they were trading a lot of crops, and they were one of the centers for the slave trade. Okay, so we see that everything changes once the Spanish come in. So the question then is that we know they're raiding for cattle, we know they're using cattle, we know they're using horses, but it appears they're doing it in a different way. Instead of like the Comanche, which had more of like a Mongol pattern where they started having large herds of horses and raiding constantly European and indigenous settlements. Here, they adapted their entire lifestyle to the horse, right? In the Yuma, however, used the horse, but only for possibly long raids against missions, but like the terminology for the tribes, for groups is definitely suspect. Not when they use, the Spanish tend to use blanket terminologies, right? What appears to be the case is that they had inter-village warning system that they use in the horse wars, so they weren't using it for warfare. And they also didn't have firearms, okay? They did have steel knives, but they did not have firearms. They never used firearms. They adapted to firearms. They zigzagged to get close to their enemy, but they did not have them. They didn't use them. But other people did, that they were allied with. So we'll get into a case here. So this is the Battle of Pima Pio. And apparently the remains of this battle are still there, but you're not allowed to go see them, and you're not allowed to go into the area. So, in a summer day in 1857, a combined force of Quechan and Mojave attacked a Maricopa settlement, raided it, and burnt it down. And so what happened is that the Maricopa went to their allies, the Tohono O'odham, and they, while the Mojave and Quechan were resting, they surrounded them, right? And so the Pima, the Tohono O'odham, were on horseback, right? And they had firearms to some extent. And the Quechan and Mojave had Apache allies and Chemehueve allies who were also mounted and on horseback. So it appears that it doesn't look like they had firearms, but Apache and Chemehuevi left, the Mojave and Kachan there. And so the Mojave and Kachan were surrounded by the cavalry, the Tohono O'odham cavalry, but they didn't fight the cavalry, right? The cavalry just corralled them, and then the battle was actually fought between the Maricopa, Mojave, and Kachan. And so this battle was fought only on foot, using war clubs and bows and arrows, okay? So, and 200 of the Mojave and Kachan were killed in this battle, and their remains were left there. That's why you can't go to that site to this day. And this, we know that how deadly this was, and because we have accounts of this from white settlers and a wagon train that was going through. So this appeared in newspapers in San Diego. So we know that this battle, we have more records of this battle, okay? But then the question is, how far can we extend this pattern of warfare back? And so that's where this experimental analysis comes in, okay? So what I am doing currently is going through archives. I'm doing it online, but I would try to get to the Huntington Library. I'm going to try to do the Bancroft when travel can extend again. But I am finding a lot of really old Spanish documents, okay, that are cramped handwriting that I'm having to learn archaic Spanish to be able to translate. It's going to be a very interesting and fun process, right? And hopefully I can get to Sevilla at some point and go to their the National Archives of the Indies there. So that would be really awesome. And they're really cool. I've been there before. Okay. So we do have archaeological specimens of the war clubs, okay? We have them at the Smithsonian. And so this has changed. What I was going to try to go to the Smithsonian and catalog their clubs and create a typology of them, okay? Typology is essentially a way for archaeologists to be able to classify artifacts. And then we can use typologies to date artifacts and tell what culture is there, what group is in the area, okay? So a lot of ceramics are used, arrowheads and points, which I'll get to in a second. I'm going to talk about some terminology that came up in class last week, okay? And so that's what the museum analysis would be. And here's some examples of the clubs. And so I did analyze these before. These are from the Patricia Ann Hearst Museum in Berkeley, Cal. So these are really cool. And these are, this is a ball club. And so these are mallet clubs, and this is what I call a stick club or truncheon club. And do I have? Yes. And so this is a Apache rawhide club, and then this is a ball club here. So what I was going to be doing with this, and what I'm still going to try to be doing, is recreating those clubs, specifically that mallet club and the truncheon club here, and this ball club, and possibly this club, we'll see. And I'll be testing them out in my experiment. So what we know is that these clubs were thrust to the face, shown here, to knock an opponent off balance, and then a side strike to the parietal, right, was supposed to kill them. So perimortem trauma. We're looking at the difference between antemortem face thrust and perimortem parietal strikes to the head. Okay. And so what I was going to be doing, and let's see, so doing a replicative study to recreate these clubs. So here's an example that I did previously. So this is based on my MA thesis, where I tested how lethal these clubs were. Now we're expanding this out, and we're connecting it back to indigenous groups. So what I'm going to be doing is working with indigenous groups in the Mojave, so Colorado River Indian tribes, which I mentioned earlier in Parker. And I'll be working with them to learn how these clubs were used, why were they continued to be used, what was the significance of these clubs, was there any rituals associated with their making, how were they made, and so on. Okay, so definitely doing a collaborative experiment. So what we also term as ethno-experimental archaeology. Right? A lot of terms clash together. Okay, so this is how I recreated the clubs. I used an axe here, machetes and chisels, which they wouldn't have. They were using stone tools, or were they? I'm not entirely sure. I don't know what they were using because there's no records of it, because previous ethnographers did not think it was interesting. So now now this is the reason why we have gaps in the record, because there's a lot of problems with primary accounts where they gloss over, maybe they lie, maybe they exaggerate. We're not entirely sure, so we have to go back in and replicate and go through the archival with a different perspective, the archival data with a different perspective, and be able to create a whole picture of what's going on. So this is the specimens that I previously tested. Okay, so these ones I create. These are the ones I created here. These ones, these two in the back, and then this one here. These other ones were used as a control. So this is like a Maasai War Club, Iroquois War Club, Tongan War Club, and so this is just elkhorn billet and a hammerstone. So we were trying to figure out if people could just grab a random stick off the ground, or which is this here, or if they could just use a billet or a hammerstone. So this is what is used to make stone tools. Okay. So what I did is I beat the crap out of a crash test dummy to see how lethal these clubs were. Okay, and so I'm going to be doing this in the future. I work with Cal State LA. They have a biomechanical engineering lab there that has this crash test dummy, so I'll be working with them. What we'll be doing is, so what I did is I struck it, right? Face thrust, and then also to a parietal thrust. And so we measured the force of the blows with these clubs, okay? So next what we'll be doing is having a machine do this at the same time, so we can take out the human element. And so what we also did is hit something called Fujifilm pre-scale pressure paper. So what happens is that when this is struck, it releases a red dye at different pressures. Okay, so we can see the pattern of the strike and how much pressures per square inch is exerted by the strikes. So what we see is, and I'm trying to get an article out on this, hopefully it'll be out by the summer, and publishing is a pain in the butt. It just takes forever. But what we see is here we have my recorded force from these strikes, okay? So, and then these two lines here, so we have the recorded force, and these two lines here, this light gray one and this darker gray one down here, these are the ranges of known fracture force studies. So what we see is that all these are the parietal strikes, okay? All these strikes would cause skull fracture. Okay, but it doesn't look like. Okay, so we see here when compared to the abbreviated injury scale, which is another measurement created by the automotive industry, we can see what type of fracture is caused. So as you see here, most of the strikes would get up to a comminuted fracture. Okay, and they. Almost all of them would cause, except for the smaller ones, and I'll get into the problem with that later, the smaller strikes areas, and cause that closed, simple, or linear fractures that we talked about, okay? That we're talking about blunt force trauma here. And some would even cause up to, like this Okamala here, would cause up to, at 77%, which is pretty high, a complex with the brain tissue exposed fracture, and then also major penetrating injury could be caused at 40%. And this would be both 4 and 5 are lethal. 2 and 3 could be lethal. Okay, 2 could also be antemortem. And the problem with the more focused strikes is that since it doesn't have a large surface area, the sensors don't measure it as well as the large strikes. So what we hear now, we're moving on to the frontal strikes. And what we see, so this is also studies of frontal trauma. And what we see is that they could cause fracture, right? They likely wouldn't be lethal. So most of them would not even cause skull fracture, okay? So this is that when we looked at that blunt force trauma, the antemortem healing trauma, this is what would cause that, okay? By a thrust to the face. Mostly on the frontal lobe. And so here's that compared to the AIS, and you see that it doesn't cause much trauma at all. Okay, so now we compare it to the pressure paper, and what we can see with this is that the peak pressures also would cause a lot of trauma. And there's a weird thing going on with the frontal strikes that I'm not entirely sure about. And so I have to revise these methods. And what we'll be doing is looking at this data in terms of we have some pressure sensing gear that we're going to be using when I get a grant that will provide more accurate results. And so what's most important is we can get the area of the strikes, right? And we can compare this to bioarchaeological data. However, bioarchaeological data, they didn't measure both two-axis measurements for radius, which is what you have to do to get the actual area of an ellipse. So their data is useless. So now I'm saying your data is useless. This is how we're going to rectify it. And so this is what the when we put it through Photoshop and we get our results, this is what we have for our pressure paper. And so you have a spherical strike here, ellipsoidal here, so this is a linear. And so this is that frontal strike. And you can see how interesting it is. This is an edge pattern here. This is very diffuse strike here. So what I did is take some high-speed imagery, but what we can do is use this to get the depth of the strike here. So we see how the pressure, so we can actually measure how much that head moves, okay? So what I was doing was essentially connecting what we know in the, trying to connect what we know from the historic record back to the past, to the prehistoric record of violence. But what's more importantly, what I'm doing is decolonizing narratives of passive victims, right? That they just automatically adopted superior technology, that they didn't resist, that they didn't try to maintain their identity. So this is what my overarching goal is, okay? To provide new ways of looking at the past and looking at how indigenous people resisted, adapted, resisted, or redefined technologies to suit their own lifestyles and their own choices in their societies. Okay, so that's my research, and now I'm going to go into a little bit about stone tools for extra credit. Okay, so firstly, I talked a little bit about this. So this is that Acheulean hand axe we talked about. And there's that sexy hand axe theory. So what technology is sexy? It's Acheulean hand axes, because the theory is that they're symmetrical, and this is this form of signaling, mate selection, sexual selection shit, like we learned about way back in the beginning, right? This was to signify to your mate that you were very you're a good tool maker. You can make the best tool. You can make it symmetrical, beautiful, and show how prominent you are, how good you are, right? How much better you are than everybody else. It's a sexy hand axe theory. Okay, and so we talked about Upper Paleolithic tools a little bit, and there's a lot of debate about two different types of technologies. One is the Solutrean, and the other one is the Clovis. And I'll bring this up because there's this false theory out there, is that it's called the Solutrean hypothesis, that Europeans, in fact, were the first people into the New World. And so they compare this Solutrean technology up here, they compare that to the Clovis technology. And you see there are some similarities. They're both bifacially worked, they're large points made for spearheads, but there are some key differences. And the most difference is that there's this basal notching here. So this is so that they could haft this to a spear handle. So this doesn't have that notching, right? And so they're not the same. Okay, but they have the same function. Both of these were used to hunt what we know megafauna, so mammoths and giant sloths, things of that nature. So they had the same function. They're not the same culture, right? They're different cultures, but they did have the same function. So Solutrean is European, appears in the Upper Paleolithic about 22,000 to 17,000 years ago. Okay, Clovis is North American spear technology, Paleo-Indian, and it's estimated 13.5 to 12.8 thousand years ago. However, we're pushing this back to 18,000 years ago with new information that's coming out, possibly earlier. So we're not entirely sure about how the people of the New World happened, but there is a lot of evidence that came from Northern Asia. There's possibly Polynesia, but we're not entirely sure. There's not enough data to prove it at this point. Okay, but both, like I said, were used to hunt megafauna. Okay, so remember, Upper Paleolithic technology is Solutrean or Clovis. Okay, so Clovis is Paleo-Indian, but just say what other technologies, stone tool technologies, did early humans use? Early Homo sapiens use Solutrean and Clovis. Okay, and then don't forget your sexy hand axe. All right, so that's it. It was a pleasure teaching you all this spring, and I hope everyone made it through okay. And I know this was a tough transition, and I hope everyone's safe out there. Let me know if you have any questions. And the extra credit is posted as you see this. So fill that out. And also the test, don't forget, is due May 15th. And any late work, anything you have is all due May 15th. So it'll give me a couple days to be able to grade it and then post it and get your grades in. So then you can know exactly where you stand. I will try to get everything done by the beginning next week, everything graded that you have so far, so that you can know what you have before the final. Okay. Don't forget, you have 2 attempts to take this test. Okay. So you have 2 attempts to take it. It's open note. Let me know if you have any issues or questions of it. I'm here at all times. Just send me an email. And I'm getting your emails. I'm getting your assignments. So just know that. And I know there are other. I don't know if you can still take an incomplete, but I won't. I'll come out and say this. I won't be failing anyone. Okay. I won't even give D's this semester. Okay. So the lowest you can get right now is a C, and pretty much everybody has, at least, even if they have a D right now, it's a high D, and so I'll be scaling it up. But please take the last test, and should everyone who takes that test should be come out with it with at least a B, and that will put everyone's grade at least a C anyways. So let me know if you have any more questions about that. And stay safe out there. And like I said before, stay safe, and I hope everyone's doing well. Okay. And let me know if there's any issues at all. Any issues with the test, any issues in taking it. If anything comes up, let me know and we'll work something out. Okay. Well, I'll see you hopefully next semester. Drop by my office anytime if you have any questions about school in general or questions about anthropology. My door is always open.